springs and wells have always been held to be sacred. A great deal in the Bible about springs and wells. Genesis 26 is a very interesting chapter to read. It talks about the many wells which Abraham's servants had dug, and I think it was the Philistines that stopped them, and then they were opened up again. And it's very interesting to see that the wells were given names. It was almost as though a personality was given to the spring or well, which is important because, as we shall see, in our Christian dispensation, wells have been named after saints, but very often the name that they have now is only a corruption or a rededication from some other dedication which existed long before the Christian faith that ever came here. When we were talking about angels, I said how important it was to try to get a feeling of the way people conceived of the world around them. I used the expression that to them the world, the universe, was a pleroma of spiritual beings. They felt themselves to be connected with the spiritual world which surrounded them on every hand. All life was to them an expression of spirit. This, of course, is the very opposite of what it is today. Most people approach the world in a purely mechanistic kind of way, but to people 2,000 years and more ago, all life was an expression, an embodiment of spirit. And one could also say that to them, all human life and activity was seen as the expression of spiritual activity, the work of spirit beings. I think it surely reminded us that for every activity of mankind, it was felt that there was an angel who was working in and through that activity. Just perhaps difficult for us to get quite the feeling of this, and yet it is rather important if we're to understand the subject. So, wherever man contacted nature, and indeed he felt that he was always in contact with nature, he felt that he was in the presence of great primordial forces, the sense of great powerful forces which indwelt nature, so that wherever the lightning flashed and the thunder clapped, or whether the sea smashed against the cliffs or lapped upon the beach, men felt that they were in the presence of the gods. And especially this was so with water which was conceived of as being very much part of the life force, for of course no life can exist without water. But also water has the power of destruction. We know of floods which inundate the land, causing great death and destruction. We know, of course, that people can drown in floods. So that wherever water bubbled forth out of the earth, or where a stream flowed over the pebbles, or a river rushed forth, or in the presence of a waterfall, people felt there that a spirit was involved. They felt that spiritual beings indwelt the water, or that there was a god or a goddess who was actually responsible for that life-giving water which sprang forth. So, in talking about these things, we're talking about something that is as old as mankind. We're really going back in our thinking over many thousands of years, and we're really talking about the ancient nature law. Some people think of this as witchcraft, but witchcraft in the proper sense, I'm not talking about black magic, but the old nature religion, of course, is what we're really talking about here. People felt this deep-seated feeling. They were inspired by feelings of awe and reverence and fear, because here was the water springing forth, life-giving, mysterious. It was difficult to explain how and why it came forth out of the earth in the way that it did. And of course the water was unpredictable, beyond control, and a very strange force was here. So people felt that they were in the presence of spiritual beings. They felt that here was the abode of a spiritual being. This was the dwelling place of a God. And so wherever you got this natural phenomenon of a spring gushing forth out of the earth, folk felt the need to pray, perhaps to offer sacrifice, also to assuage the anger of the god or the goddess who indwelt the spring or the well, the need to propitiate the god. And quite obviously these places, because of this feeling of reverence and awe and devotion, the feeling of mystery, the feeling of being in the presence of some great spiritual power, these places became places of worship. People came there. Maybe Mary will have something to say this when it tells us about pilgrimages, but I suppose a lot of pilgrimages actually were associated with places such as this. And wherever a god or goddess was perceived to be, of course, people felt they were in touch with the supernatural, and therefore they would invoke the power of the spirit or the power of the god or goddess. If they were sick, people would naturally go to the holy place for healing, or if they had some kind of problem, they would go there for guidance. If a woman was childless, she would go to the well in the hope that there the goddess of fertility might be invoked and would answer her prayer. The interesting thing, of course, is that in talking about the feelings of these people from thousands of years ago, we find that this is not very far removed, after all, from the way people feel today. Because I don't suppose you ever come to any spring or well without finding that people have tossed coins into it. It's very strange, this. One of the hardest things, perhaps the hardest thing that the Celtic Church had to do and failed to do, was to remove the idea of the sacredness of these holy places. I don't think the Celtic Church obviously never succeeded in taking people away from well worship. We know this because of the way in which certain wells are regarded today. You'll know, for instance, how in Derbyshire, I think, and in Staffordshire, they have these well dressing festivals, usually at Ascension Tide, and they make these beautiful sort of floral designs, very often depicting scenes from the Bible, but they make them out of damp clay and then press the petals in to make these beautiful pictures. And this, of course, is just a continuation of something that goes back many thousands of years. The thing is that why is it that something like this has come down to us today? In other words, despite this change of religious belief, you can go to any pool or well and you'll find money cast in. And the question that I'm asking is that why do people feel the need to toss a coin into water? I mean, I don't know whether I'm different or you're different from me, but I certainly have this sort of feeling in the presence of water. It almost seems to be the right thing to toss a coin into the water. Yes. Yeah. Of course, going back into Bible days and long before, people in those circumstances, if they felt that they were encroaching or trespassing upon the preserve of the gods, what they would have done would have been to have offered a human sacrifice beforehand. We find this element of human sacrifice quite strongly alluded to in the Bible. We find that Abraham was quite willing to sacrifice Isaac until his hand was stayed. There was always this feeling in the presence of the great forces of nature that you had to do something to earn the favour of the spiritual being who was there embodied. Is there something deep-seated in the psyche that is there some need that we feel to act in exactly the same way as our forebears did all these thousands of years ago when they went to the well and where they worshipped and made their offerings to the goddess? I may have something to say about skulls and headhunting. You might wonder what the connection is. We all know that there are tribes of headhunters. Either is it Central America or South America or maybe in Africa, but there are certain tribes that hunt heads. But headhunting is something that we find also in the Bible. Very, very interesting, this. And the reason I mention it, although it looks as if it hasn't got any connection, is that there was a time when a skull, a head, would be cut off and put into the well as an offering to the god or the goddess. And in excavating many of these wells, they have found a skull, which again is very interesting. And I find, for instance, in the scriptures that not only did David slay Goliath, with his pebble and the slingshot, but he cut off his head and then carried his head around. The enemies of Saul, if you remember how Saul was slain, he was the first king of Israel. His head was cut off. And afterwards it says that his body was pinned to the wall. But it doesn't mention what happened to his head. Obviously his head was carried around. Then there's a story in the Old Testament of Jehu, who was the king of Israel, slaying, if I remember rightly, 70 of I think they were the descendants of the previous king of Israel, King Ahab, and their heads were cut off and carried around in baskets. We sort of almost miss these things in reading the scriptures until we find that this business of headhunting, carrying heads around of the enemies, tossing a severed head into the well, we find a relationship here. We find that there's a deep spiritual feeling comes from this. The usual explanation being, I suppose, that if you possess the head of your enemy, you possess something of the spirit of that man and the intelligence of that man and all of his finest qualities. These, I suppose, were thought to reside in the head. So you struck off the head of a person and you preserved the head, and thereby you partook of his intelligence and his power and his acclaim. So all these are very interesting, and as I said, it's a big subject, and it's only when you begin to study this in the context of how the Celtic Church took upon it the legacy of Alexandria and Judaism and Druidism, and the Druids took on the legacy of the previous ancient Britons and of the nature worship, that you see just how, I was going to say complicated, I don't know whether it's complicated, but how you get a beautiful sort of pattern coming together one thing one could say is that Christian faith is not the pure thing that a lot of people think it is. They sort of stand in condemnation of other religions. They say Christianity supersedes all these, and this is a pure revelation of God. But in its manifestation, in the way that it's come down to us, of course, it isn't. It's very much an admixture of these foreign elements. The other thing, of course, that has to be said is that where the new religion came, it utilised not only the sacred sites of the previous religion, but also the clergy. I was asking Shirley about this. You know how that after the Roman invasion, Claudian invasion, AD 43, the Druids were driven back into their last stronghold of Anglesey, and there were slaughtered. And some people think of this as being the end of the Druids, but obviously the Druidic priesthood did continue, maybe underground. But Shirley, you did say that the Druid priests became the clergy of presumably became the clergy of the Celtic Church, I think. No clear demarcation from where one religion ended and another one began. And this question of well worship was the most difficult to eradicate so far as the Christian Church was concerned. Talking again about heads and severed heads, you find these, of course, even in the decoration of churches. You sometimes find heads at the top of pillars, and again this goes back to.
Still have their heads with the water coming down.
Yes, that's another very ancient symbolism, which obviously predates Christianity. And then, of course, you've got gargoyles, which suggests the idea of the gargoyle, the hideous heads that you see on the outside of churches. The idea there was to drive off evil spirits, which suggests that when the church began to be established in these islands, there was very much still a pervading kind of dread and fear of the gods and the spirit beings who previously occupied the site. I think I've mentioned before, but it's worthy of mention again, that of course, first of all, in the siting of ancient churches, whereas today we think we could just put up a church on any available site, perhaps where there's a row of shops and just a place in between where you can buy the ground and build a church, or a vacant lot on the street corner. In Bible days, or long before that, in fact, you would never have dreamt of putting up a church or sacred building on any old site, or any site. It would have, in fact, have been an old site. It was a site that was spiritually divine. And there is a book which I have, but unhappily have never read. It's called The Pattern of the Past by Guy Underwood. Is it? He does say that there was a what you call a blind spring at the centre of every stone circle. Apparently, dowsers have gone over these sites and almost without fail have found the evidence of water running underground. So our most ancient churches were situated on sites which were already sanctified and sacred long before. Many of our oldest parish churches, I'm certain, are built on the site of stone circles. I have clairvoyantly seen this in quite remarkable circumstances on more than one occasion, and then have found some kind of verification. And of course, whether there was a stone circle there or not, it is a fact that you find many of our most ancient churches in close proximity to water. I've not been there, but I understand that there is a well, or the site of a spring, actually incorporated into York Minster. York Minster is built over the site of what was an ancient, I think you call it a wooden church, which is built over the site of the spring. And I understand that you can still see that. Of course, it's believed that at Chalice Well, that there was an early Christian settlement there. Geoffrey Ash points out that there was a monastic settlement halfway up the Tor. And of course in Glastonbury Abbey you find there that there's you can actually see the well in St Mary's, St Joseph's chapel. So you find this in so many of our churches that they're actually built on a site which was holy and sanctified long before there was a church there, and there usually seems to be water associated with these sites. So the early Christians came with the new faith, which gradually began to be adopted by the people of these islands, but the same sites remain. That's the important thing for us to understand. A new slant was given to the religion, to the new religion, but it incorporated features from the old, and people did not readily, if ever, give up entirely their adherence to the old saints or the old gods and goddesses which inhabited the sacred places. The church couldn't, in other words, eradicate these primitive feelings that people had any more than the church today can eradicate them. People are still superstitious. People still make a statement and then say touch wood. Lots and lots of superstitions that we have today, the origins of which are almost lost to us. The interesting thing was that since the clergy in the earliest days couldn't eradicate these feelings, they couldn't, and perhaps daren't repudiate the ancient sites, they adopted them. And whereas the well, the sacred spring, had an ancient dedication to some god or goddess or spirit or nymph, the convenient thing was to rededicate the well or spring, so that many of today's dedications actually are just are a Christian nomenclature, but originally there was an older one. We'll talk about wells dedicated to St Bridget, for instance, but originally St Bridget was Brigantia, was the pagan goddess. So the church came along, and where there was a well or a spring dedicated to Brigantia or one of the other pagan goddesses, a new dedication would be made to some saint or other. So we see really that we've gone from pagan to Christian, and I sometimes wonder whether we're not going now from Christian back to pagan again, because there is a rebirth of feeling. The old religion is making itself felt again. There is a new intuitive awareness of the life of spirit. There's a new faculty of spiritual cognition developing. Rudolf Steiner, of course, said that this would be so. And a lot of people, whether they're anthroposophists or not, have this kind of intuitive feeling that we're right at the birth of the dawn of a new age, in which people will have a much more refined sensitivity and feeling towards the whole world of nature. So this is a really wonderful subject, really. And of course it doesn't, we're talking about wells and springs, but there are various other features as well that the church has inherited. One thing that would make a very interesting study is the subject of language. What our English language owes to the church. Perhaps not so much to the Celtic church, because there's not many Celtic words have come down to us today. Mostly where the Celtic language or words in the Celtic tongue have come down to us is in the names of places, rivers in particular, quite a number of rivers. But inasmuch as the Celts were, I was talking about this last Friday, wasn't I? Inasmuch as the Celts were a repressed and subjugated people and were driven into the fastnesses of the mountains and the westernmost areas, not much of the language has survived except, for instance, with the names of rivers. And it's interesting there that whether it was the Roman invaders or the Anglo-Saxons that came after them, that they didn't change the name of the river. They still kept the old Celtic names, which had their association with the god or goddesses. So today people still have special feelings about wells, and they toss their coins in, or sometimes they put pins into the well, perhaps not with no real thought about what they're doing, without any understanding that they're doing something that people have been doing probably for thousands of years. But yet one has to ask the question, what is it then that people really feel? Who or what do they think is going to answer their prayer or grant their wishes? Wishing wells. Anyway, if you get the picture that the church moved in, it couldn't wipe out, it couldn't annihilate the old well worship, so it reformed it, it changed it slightly, it gave it a veneer of respectability by dedicating it to the saints. And of course the water was very useful for baptisms. We're told that the first baptisms in this country took place at Glastonbury, when, if the story be true, when Joseph of Arimathea and his party came and made their first converts, they were baptised with water from Chalice Well. Which brings me to the point that it has long been believed that a holy man or holy woman had the power to cause water to spring forth out of the earth. It's interesting that today dowsing has such a bad image so far as Christians are concerned, or evangelical, fundamentalist Christians are concerned. They would sort of equate it with black magic or sorcery, or I don't know what. Spiritualism is what they would usually condemn it as. I would just like to ask anybody who is in doubt about this subject, how do they think that the people in Bible days dug their wells? Do they imagine that they just dug at random, just hoping to strike water? And how far do they think they had to dig down before they would get some? Obviously, in those days, people just went out as they are able to do today with their divining rods and could detect not only the presence of the water, but would know exactly how far down the water was. Of course, Moses brought forth water from the rock. His sin, according to Scripture, was the fact that he struck the rock, where actually all he needed to do was to speak, and the vibration, the spiritual vibration of his voice would have been sufficient to cause the water to spring forth from the earth. Of course, in comparatively modern times, a perfect illustration of this is in Marie Bernard Soubirous, better known as Bernadette, and the whole phenomenon of Lourdes. 1844 was the year in which Bernadette was born, and she was just 14 years of age in 1858 when she had this vision of the Virgin Mary, who appeared to her on many occasions, over a dozen occasions. Virgin Mary told Bernadette to go and drink from the spring and to wash in the water. And there was no spring there was no water. And the Virgin pointed with her finger, and Bernadette went where the Virgin was pointing, and she put her hands in the earth and just scrabbled about, and a spring of water came forth. And she tried to drink from it. It was so muddy that she couldn't at first. But then the water came more and more until within a matter of days, hundreds and thousands of gallons were flowing. But I mean, there is a remarkable instance in modern days of water being brought forth by a holy person, or person who's regarded as holy by the church. But in the study of wells and springs in this country, we find quite a number of instances like this. There's a St. Augustine's well. It's at Synonymous in Dorset. This was not Augustine of Hippo, but of course the Augustine who came in 597 as the emissary of Pope Gregory from Rome. And he is said, according to the legend, to have called forth water out of the ground when he was actually lost and thirsty. And so he needed a drink, and he called forth water out of the ground. But another version of the story says that it was shepherds with their sheep, and the sheep had no water, and Augustine undertook to provide water for them and called forth a spring of water. So there at Cerne Abbas you've got a St. Augustine's well. In the Highlands of Scotland you find particularly there's a tradition of epilepsy being able to be healed through the water from a holy well, and especially if the well contained the skull of a suicide. Very remarkable this. I don't know why it had to be a suicide, but that's how the local legend goes. You could be healed of epilepsy by drinking water from the holy well, and the water was doubly powerful if it had got a skull in it, and particularly if you could drink from the skull of a suicide. The idea, of course, about going back to skulls and headhunting was that if the skull was thrown into the water, not only had the water got healing, life-giving properties, but also the head itself was conceived of as being the seat of life and intelligence. So you were enhancing and increasing the power of the water. You could be healed of your toothache if you went to the right well. You could get your toothache healed so long as you made the right offering. What I'm suggesting here is that since you were calling upon a supernatural power in association with the water, you had to be careful that you did not abuse or take advantage of that spiritual being or the goddess, whoever or whatever it was. There are some wells where if you obtain one specific answer to prayer, your wish was granted, you were not allowed to go a second time. It was as though the power would be decreased if it was drawn upon too often. Or maybe it was that the god or goddess or spirit would be angry with you if you took advantage of it. It's interesting the things that used to be tossed into wells. Some wells used to contain holy trout. Trout was a very special well. And the trout had to be given special offerings, and they're supposed to have liked hazelnuts. I'd never heard of trout actually feeding on hazelnuts, but I do know that hazelnuts were considered to be, again, something to do with fertility. So maybe the tradition has got garbled here, but certainly hazelnuts used to be tossed into wells. Sacred trout fed on them, and the idea was also that the trout gained supernatural wisdom from the nuts which were thrown down the well. You must always, in going to the well, you must always treat it courteously. When 4 weeks ago we were talking about angels and about the spirits which inhabit nature, I didn't, of course, mention how that the tradition still obtains in Ireland today that you bow to the fairies. Possibly in the Highlands of Scotland you could go over a bridge. So you always had to treat the occupant of the well very courteously, otherwise they might react badly and you might get more than you bargained for. At the very least, the power might not work, or it might work against you, or the well might dry up, or the spring might move off somewhere else, which was always a possibility. I mean, when we think about this, it's quite obvious that a spring of water can come out at a certain place and then change and come up somewhere else. But people felt that that somebody had upset the goddess, and so she had removed because she had been abused and ill-treated. So certainly wells with healing properties, and some with prophetic properties as well, wells that could foretell the future. They were reckoned to do this by people observing that the level of the water would change, or sometimes the colour of the water would change, or the flow of water would increase or decrease. It might dry up altogether. All these were taken as portents of the future. At Oundle, where there's a famous school now, Oundle in Northamptonshire, there used to be a well which I think it doesn't exist now, but it was known as a drumming well. And people used to hear this drumming sound come from it, no doubt of perfectly capable of perfectly natural explanation. But this well was always reckoned to drum whenever there was going to be a change in the political affairs of the nation. Some of you will have heard of Richard Baxter, the famous divine who was Vicar of Kidderminster. There's a big statue of him in Kidderminster, who was Vicar of the parish church there. He reckoned to have heard this drumming well sound. In fact, he wrote a book called Certainty of the World of Spirits, in which he refers to this well drumming at the time of the Civil War. And then there's a well in Staffordshire at a place called Rushton Spencer, actually a well dedicated to St Helen. And this well was always reckoned to dry up just before some calamity. And they said that it dried up before the Civil War, it dried up before the execution of Charles I. So people kept a very close look on what was happening to their local spring or well. As I said, we can only really begin to understand this as we can enter into the feelings, the soul feelings of the people concerned. Then there's another spring in Oxfordshire, Assendon Spring. This spring in Oxfordshire was reckoned to flow only before war. In other words, it's normally a dry spring, but they found that it began to flow. Water came out in 1914 and 1939. So again, it was reckoned to foretell the coming of war. There's a lot of well lore, I think, associated with the Midlands, Derbyshire, Staffordshire, Northamptonshire. Near to Brampton in Northamptonshire, there's a spring called Marvelsyke. I don't know what the derivation of the name is. Marvel, M-A-R-V-E-L, Syke, S-I-K-E, one word, Marvelsyke Spring, which also was just the opposite of Assendon Spring, was reckoned to dry up before any death in the local community or before any calamity. And then there are some springs that you find are called corn springs. The sale of corn harvest and the sale of corn, of course, was very important to the community. And you find a corn spring at a place called Barton Mere near Bury St Edmunds. And the law, L-O-R-E, varies from one corn spring to another, but in at least one of these springs it was reckoned that if the level of water was high, you get a good price for your corn, and if it was low, you get a low price for your corn. And probably this makes some sense if you think about it. Then there were wells where you could go, not with just your request for healing or help, but you could go particularly, you could use the well as an oracle You could inquire about your friends or relatives who were absent. I mean, there was no letters, no post as we have it today, certainly no telephone. If someone was far distant and you hadn't had any message from them and you were getting a bit concerned about their welfare, no pun intended, you could go to the well and gaze down into its depths until you could see your face reflected, and then you could ask the guardian of the well, give the name of your friend and ask what had happened, and watch the reaction of the water. And if the water bubbled up enthusiastically, it meant your friend is perfectly all right, he's doing well. And if the water turned muddy and horrid, it meant that your friend was sick. And if it didn't do anything at all, he died. So this was, again, an instance of the way in which people used these wells to obtain information. It was a kind of divination. That's the word that we would use today. Then there were other kinds of wells, magic wells. One that I found, discovered in Northumberland, at a place called Otterburn, and it's known as the Silver Well. Silver Well, which was reckoned to turn all things to precious metal. Very useful indeed. But, of course, you had to give the well the requisite offering, which in this case was reckoned to be pine cones. Why the spirit of the well, what the spirit of the well would actually do with the pine cones, I don't know. But if you gave the right offering, whatever it was, whatever well, you could reckon that your request would be favourably received. Then there were certain wells which were reckoned to influence the weather. They could even cause storms, especially, I suppose, if you upset them. But these weather wells particularly liked you to give them an offering of white stones. So if you found one of these wells and excavated the bottom of it, you'd probably find a lot of white stones there. Another very ancient and widespread practice was that of smashing pottery and offering broken crocks to the goddess or the spirit. Apparently this was quite a widespread practice, and I've often thought about this. Those of you who've got a garden, how often when you're digging in the garden you come across broken crockery? I had thought about this, and there is also, of course, the question of helping the drainage of the soil, but the practice seems to be so widespread that I wonder if there isn't some kind of spiritual belief underlying it, especially so, as I found in my investigations on this subject, that it was the done thing, the right thing, to offer broken crockery to the well or to the spring. Many wells are dedicated to St. Anne. St. Anne, as you may know, was reckoned as the mother of the Virgin Mary, so Jesus' grandmother, which gives them their name of Granny Wells, or in France, Grand-mère, Granny Wells. And apparently you find quite a number of these in Europe and in this country. The ancient derivation, or the ancient attribution, was to Anu, A-N-U, in Ireland anyway. And Anu was reckoned to be the mother of the gods. Then, of course, the Celtic Church came along, took over, and the dedication was changed from that to Anu to the similar sounding Anne. There's a St. Anne's spring or well in Brittany called St. Anne de la Palue, but I've not been able to find out what Palue means. It isn't in my French dictionary. P-A-L-U-E. So if anybody comes across the meaning of that, I'd be quite interested to know. At Buxton in Derbyshire, there was a St. Anne's well, which actually Thomas Cromwell, he actually closed down this St. Anne's well in Buxton But we do know that that well was venerated in Roman times, and we think that it was dedicated to a pagan nymph or goddess, because I seem to remember that they actually found the bust of an ancient goddess actually in the well when it was excavated. Anyway, Cromwell closed it down in 1538. But 30 years later, it was reopened, because by that time Buxton was beginning to become famous as a spa town. I mean, it had been famous from Roman times for its mineral waters. So that well actually came back into use again. But the springs there at Buxton were once dedicated to the Celtic goddess Armenitia, Armenitia, Armenitia. And then another St Anne's well which I've come across is on St Anne's Hill in Surrey, and there you were required to give coins or bent pins. What the spirit of the well would do with a bent pin, I don't know. Then I mentioned earlier about ladies going to the well if they were barren. So there are certain wells that had a special reputation as fertility wells, because the water was reckoned to be a cure for barrenness. I mean, water with its power to promote life. And there's one in particular that I've heard about on the Isle of Skye, Tobar and Torra. Tobar, Tobar, and A-N, Torra, Torraida. Well, I've already mentioned the cult of skulls and the fact of heads being highly regarded in biblical days. Of course, in the Bible also we find that people were burned to death as a sacrifice to the gods. Remember, of course, the great condemnation which came down on Solomon's head was that he worshipped all these pagan gods, and Israel sacrificed their sons and daughters to the gods and caused them to pass through the fire, and some were burned in the fire, which meant that they were literally burned alive. We find this principle or this tradition of burning people alive as a sacrifice in Druidism as well. So there's something rather sinister here, and it's interesting that skulls become associated with wells, and the Celts set up the skulls of their enemies to defend sacred places. It's interesting, isn't it, that you see the way in which people were executed in the Middle Ages, comparatively recent times, by being burned to death. I mean, it is really grotesque and horrid to think about it, that people were burned alive. We all of us know, of course, of Caesar's claim that the Druids sacrificed people in a kind of wickerwork giant. We've seen the picture probably of people being put inside this giant wickerwork man and then being burned to death. But just as it seems that there's this sort of feeling for the old sites, S-I-T-E-S, of nature and the old nature worship, it makes you wonder whether there isn't some deep-seated something in the psyche that makes people resort to this kind of behaviour, so that people were executed by being burned alive. And then you think about poor Abbot Whiting, the last abbot of Glastonbury, and the quite horrific circumstances of his trial and arraignment and subsequent execution, where his head was struck off from his body was quartered, and his head was stuck up on the gate of Glastonbury Abbey. It's exactly the same thing that was being done hundreds and thousands of years before, burning people to death, cutting off their head, displaying their head. But many wells have actually been found to contain skulls. This is the remarkable fact. And especially in very ancient wells, going back to early British or later Roman times. And there was a particular well which was excavated at a place called Carraborough in Northumberland. There was a well that was enclosed by a temple. I suppose it was a Roman temple, 40 foot square, And when they excavated the well, they found over 13,000 coins. They also found there whole vessels and broken vessels. They found altars to the goddess, and again they found one human skull, which is again very interesting. And the dedication of that well in ancient times was to the Celtic goddess Coventina. St Winifred's well at Holywell in Flintshire. This well, dedicated to St Winifred, Gerard Manley Hopkins has actually written a couple of poems, dedicated to this St Winifred. Her ancient name was Gwenfrewin, and she lived in the 7th century. The reason I mention her here is that the origin of the well is attributed to the death of St Winifred. Apparently she was decapitated by her boyfriend. She repulsed his advances, so he struck up her head with a single blow of the sword, and her head rolled down the hill, and where it came to rest, a spring of water came forth. And the story says that he was struck dead by a thunderbolt, or another version of the story says that the earth opened up and swallowed him. But a delightful story, and the well is still there to this day. And then also, of course, associated with this is the fact that, and I think this happened to St Winifred's well, that the well was not just named. They didn't say, oh, well, this is now St Winifred's well, but they actually dedicated, and we would say christened, the well. And so I suppose the well would be dressed up. And it's the same sort of thing that we've got today with dressing the well at Ascension Tide. And incidentally, we have exactly the same tradition in some churches where the bell of the church would actually be christened. A new bell would be cast for the church, sometimes to replace an old one which had cracked. And they'd get the new bell, and they would dress it in a christening robe and then christen it. Another well or spring that is said to owe its origin to the head of a saint is St Lud's well in Brecknockshire. St Lud, L-U-D, who was a lady saint. So there's a tremendous lot really that one could say more about these wells, but I think that's enough.